Good afternoon. My name is Al Black, and this is Chewing the Gristle. And today we are recording this on Martin Luther King Day. So I hope you are doing something of service and reflecting on what Martin Luther King had to say and represents for America. I want to welcome my co-host, the poet Tim Conroy.
My brother Al, how you doing today?
Wonderful. And our guest poet today comes to us from Massachusetts. It is the poet Matthew E. Henry. Welcome.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Yes, but we're happy to have you. Matthew E. Henry is the author of Teaching While Black, Main Street Rag 2020, and Dust and Ashes, Californios Press 2020, and is editor-in-chief of The Weight Journal. He keeps getting nominated for pushcarts and best of the nets, but no joy yet. His recent poetry and prose are appearing or forthcoming in Barron Magazine, The Fiction Pool, Frontier Poetry, Massachusetts Review, Mineral Lit Mag, The New Verse News, Ninth Letter, Plowshares, Porcupine Literary, Solstice, and The Wind Hover. MEH is an educator who received his MFA from Seattle Pacific University, yet continued to spend money he didn't have, completing an MA in theology and a PhD in education from other institutions. You can find him at www.mehpoeting.com, writing about education, race, religion, and burning oppressive systems to the ground. Well, Matthew, tell me a little bit, or tell us a little bit about your poetry journey and your early influences, and when did you first begin to think, poetry might be something I should be doing?
That's something I think about a lot these days. I was, the typical child who went in elementary school. We had our poetry lessons, and I found recently a poem that I had written way back when I probably was like 4 or 5, and I compared it to some of the stuff I've written now, and I'm like, wow, I might have been better as a 4-year-old. But I sort of lost that love for poetry as I was getting older, and I became a short story writer throughout elementary school and middle school into high school. And it was actually in college where I had a professor, Carl Winderl, who's a phenomenal poet, and I was taking a creative writing class that I thought was going to be about creative writing, and poetry won't be covered. And the beginning of the year started with poetry, and I was going to grin and bear it, and then realized that this is, the ADHD kid that I am. Exposition? I don't need to worry about that for like long pieces of prose. I can just jump right in with a poem. It's awesome. And I didn't write another piece of fiction until, I think this past year. Like, it became all poetry from then on. And I just fell in love with it. It was the first time I had a teacher who was a poet teaching me about poetry. So that just brought a whole new lens to developing my ideas and how it could be seen. So instead of there being a rubric that says you have to have 3 metaphors and 2 similes and rhyme scheme for it to be a poem, anything could be a poem. And that just sort of opened up my horizons a lot. And yeah, just fell in love with the whole process from there.
Wonderful. Tim.
So I'm going to ask, because of the period we're in, how has COVID affected your writing? How has the political turmoil and chaos that we're in affected your writing this past year?
It has been both an inspiration as well as an inspiration, an escape in some places, in some ways, a spur, like I just need to get certain things out. And also it's shut me down. So like, you know, kind of covering all of those things. A lot of my poetry over the past 2 or 3 years in the midst of the political climate has been more political, more based on race, more based on looking at how we treat each other humanely and inhumanely. And as more things come out of the political climate that I have to discuss with my own students and wrestle with within my community and wrestle with friends, poetry has been a way to process those things. And so some people have called some of my poems rage poems, that I'm just like, you know, opening up a vein and screaming about something. That's accurate at times. Other times it's trying to capture things that my students have said or friends of mine have said and trying to get their story out there as well. But definitely just recently, like after the insurrection at the Capitol, I sat down to write and I had nothing. I just couldn't. I just sort of sat there and stared at the blank page and was like, I should be writing. This should be inspirational. But it was just so draining that I just stared at the page and said, I've got nothing, and had to like come to a place of realizing that's okay. Like, it's okay that I have nothing right now. But that in turn turned into a poem about having nothing in the moment and reflecting on that. So it's been a very inspirational time for me. I would much prefer to be inspired by other things that are a lot more pleasant, like, you know, squirrels and puppies and kittens. That'd be great. But, you know, you take what you got.
Describe your poetry style. Is it narrative, lyrical? Do you do free verse? Or do you do forms? Describe your style.
So I am still trying to figure out my style as much as I say I have a style. When I began writing, I was definitely more lyric. I was highly influenced by like Eliot and Cummings, and I was trying to emulate them in various ways, and Sylvia Plath, and realized I don't do that well. And so like the short story writer that I am and the storyteller that I am, I needed more narrative. And so I've been trying to find this balance between telling a story, but still having a lot of images in there. So like often I'll have the story in my mind, and I'll just start writing the story and then have to go back and say, all right, what can I cut out? A good example of this would be when I was in my MFA program, I had this poem that I thought was wonderful, and it was 6 pages long. And my mentor, Professor Hathaway, who's an amazing woman, sat me down and said, all right, I'm going to, hack this poem a little bit. And she took the 6 pages and cut it down to like 3 stanzas. That was like half a page. And I cried. And she pretty much said, this is the tension of the poem. Like, this is all you need. Just this one moment. It tells a story, but we don't need all the rest of that. And I fought against that for a little while and, dried my tears, and then said, all right, fine, maybe you're right. And I cut everything else out. And I sent it to a publisher, and they accepted it immediately. It was one of the first poems that I ever got published. And I was like, oh, maybe I do need to work with less is more. So that's something I've been trying to adapt now, not tell the entire story, but just enough that it gives the reader something to work with and leaves it to their imagination where things go next. However, I am, as you might be able to tell, I'm ADHD as all get out. So I do try to play with form every once in a while. I have a series of what I like to refer to as theological sonnets. And they are sonnets in that they are about love loosely, somewhat about love. There's 14 lines, 10 beats per line. I'll usually alternate between either 10 syllables per line, either 5 beats or 4 beats per line. There's usually a turn in there somewhere, but it's not strict iambic pentameter. It's not strict rhyming couplets, or it doesn't have a strict rhyme scheme. I'm terrible at rhyming, so I usually stay away from that. But having the rest of the form helps me just sort of stay focused. And since they're theological / philosophical sonnets, I'm trying to wrestle with a really, 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 really big age-old question in a tiny form. So get in, get out, and leave the mental consternation for somebody else to wrestle with for the rest of their life if I've done my job.
I love asking poets and writers about their formal writing process. For instance, and be as specific as you want to. Do you journal? Do you journal in the morning? Do you journal with a glass of wine after work? Do you Do you just word process? How do you do the practice that you're engaged in?
So I always, like, I'm not wearing a watch right now, but I always have a pen under my watch band, so that I can pull it out in a moment's notice, so I can always write something down. The joy of the advent of the phone, that I will be able to just put a note in immediately to remember for later on. And that's, in a lot of ways, my process is something crosses my mind, or in some cases, a student said something in class. Hold on, everyone, I need to write that down. I'm going to use that later on. I might give you credit, I might not. We'll see what happens. And I usually give them credit. And I just get it down on page immediately. I try to write every morning. I try to get into work early, about half an hour early before everybody else, and just sit at my desk and just journal, just write, just get ideas down on the page as much as possible. And then I come back to those either later on that night or the next morning, or I don't know, at a professional development and I don't feel like paying attention, and I'm revising. But yeah, my process is as ADHD as I am. Like the only formal part of it is in the morning, where I sit and try to really pore over either a new idea or something that I was working on the day before.
So, tell us about this current collection a little bit and how it came about.
Teaching While Black or Dust and Ashes?
Yeah, Teaching While Black.
Yeah, Teaching While Black is a collection of poems, like as the title says, about teaching while Black. It is largely based off of my own personal experience as a teacher for the past 19 years. Almost all of the poems are focused on teaching in a public school, high school setting. I was also a college professor for a little while, but this is mostly my public school experiences. So it deals with race as me being the Black teacher in predominantly white institutions, but it also has sections that are dealing with just the day-to-day lives of my kids that aren't based off of race. Some are based off of their sexuality or their gender identities, or there's a poem that's about a student of mine finding his father after he committed suicide. There are also poems about my students wrestling with their racial identities, and just wrestling with all of the various things that happen in a public school on a day-to-day basis, and trying to capture not just my emotions and feelings, but the stories of my kids, and in some cases my colleagues, as they've been expressed to me, usually with their permission.
How did you figure out how to organize it? Did it come easy?
There is a book whose name I'm it's called Ordering the Storm, which is just a collection of essays about how to order books of poetry. And when I was in my MFA program, I read the book then and wrote, an annotation about the book. And one of the things I remember was that every essay at some point said, just take all of your poems and put them on the ground and then just shuffle them around until you find something that works. And that's sort of how it developed. So like the three sections are loosely my experiences as a teacher and thinking about race. The second section is more broadly experiences of my students that aren't necessarily about race, but race might be a role in them. And the third section is sort of a combination of the first two sections, race and general demographic considerations of my kids in general. And that's organically sort of came about after throwing them all on the ground and moving things about.
Well, let's hear a couple poems from Teaching While Black.
Sure. This first poem is entitled Lady Macbeth. I'll try not to get emotional while reading this one. I was just reading it earlier today and it just like hit me for differently than it has in the past. Lady Macbeth. Auditory and visual hallucinations, she explains casually, as if describing the weather of California in July. 4 months into the semester, and I've just learned these familiar fiends have always been present. A strange infirmity, she says, nothing to those who know her. I don't know what she sees above our heads, the teeth and talons, the gory locks which shake between thin spaces to a rhythm only she can hear. Demons, she says, ghosts. Transfixed, she stares into horrible shadows which descend like a summer's cloud. There are no other outward signs. The fits are momentary. Soon she will again be well. But as we read, as other students keep their seats around our table, seeing only the blood Macbeth finds on the murderer's cheek, I wonder if she knows her mettle. How brave it is to sit in the midst, to daily behold such sights without a blush, without a shudder, the brains dashed out, the marrowless bones, the accusing empty eyes and the blood, the waist-high blood through which she must wade. One other poem from this collection called When Asked Why All Lives Don't Matter. After a deep breath, I attempted to explain. My aunt had breast cancer. Despite a healthy dose of science and scripture, prayers and prescriptions, the shadows never dimmed. We celebrated her life, mourned the hole her grave dug in ours. We lauded her loving kindness, questioned the natural shocks flesh is heir to, why this disease would claim a wife, a co-worker, a friend, an aunt. At the repast, heads turned to the future, saving other sons and daughters, ourselves. A collection was taken to fund breast cancer research. A medical scholarship for oncology study discussed. A proposal for new. From the back of the church hall, a woman no one recognized screamed, "What about ovarian cancer and prostate cancer? Why aren't you talking about those? All cancer mattered." Most of my students nodded into the ensuing silence, but some blank stares and my job description doomed me to be more didactic, to explain appropriate time, place, and manner, intent versus impact, the guilt and shame required to derail communal grief and hijack a narrative to make oneself more comfortable. I explained the human duty to choose. Enter the room willing to bear bodies on our shoulders, or, arms empty, leave and silently stand outside. I said, replace cancer with lives, and waited.
Wonderful, wonderful. So you mentioned a little bit about it earlier in answering one of Tim's questions, but speak to us about revision. Do you have a process you use, or is it kind of even free form with your revision? And when do you know that a poem is finished?
Yeah. So my revision process, what I'm working on is that my revision process is separate from my writing process. I'm one of those who can get into my own head while I'm writing and keep changing and changing and changing, trying to find the perfect word or the perfect moment. And now that's an impulse that I've been fighting against. And while talking to some of my students who are also writers, saying the same thing, just get the ideas down first. I've gotten better about leaving either blank spaces or I've started putting in brackets, like, you know what you'll figure out later on, just keep writing. And so I'll try to get just the ideas down. And then for me, revision, one of the big things I try to do is, I'm a musician in my background, is try to get the sound of it right. And so I will just read it out loud and read it out loud and read it out loud and try to hear what feels right. I was told by one of my professors, because I was the kid who didn't believe that, scansion and meter even existed until my MFA program. Same professor, Prof. Hathaway, said to me, for one of my poems, that my images fell apart where my the meter fell apart. And I was like, this isn't a metrical poem. What are you talking about? And then she walked me through the poem and was like, you have a very consistent meter until this moment. And where the meter fell apart, the image fell apart. And I was like, oh, I guess I now have to study image, or have to study meter now. And so I've been working on being more metrical in my thought. So sometimes it's just walking around the house while reading a poem, talking out loud to myself and feeling, oh, this is where it feels right. And then breaking that where I want the image to also be striking in some way. beyond that, it's trying to find the image that in some cases is the most shocking. So for some of my poems, I am trying to just get the reader to go, oh, wow, he just said or did that, or put the line break in a certain place where they think one thing is going to happen until they get to the next line and they go, oh, wait a minute. He tricked us. So depending on which one of those things is primary for me in the moment for that poem, sometimes it is about the line break, sometimes it's about the image, sometimes it's about the sound. I'll rewrite an entire poem based off of one line that I just think, or one image or one sound that I think is interesting, and rework everything else to fit that. So it's all very frenetic. And as for when I know it's done, I never know. I've had poems that have been published and then I'll read it and go, oh man, can I take that back and make a change? I don't like that in some ways. Or actually this year, so I'm working on a full-length collection right now, fingers crossed. And some of those poems I used in class with some of my own current students, and they gave me feedback. And some of the questions they asked made me realize there are things I need to change in this poem, because they were reading certain things into it that I was like, I can completely understand why you thought this. And that is diametrically opposed to what I want people to get out of this poem. So now I need to go back and make changes. And these are poems that were already published. So I was like, great. Now the people out in the world thinking X, Y, and Z, and oh man, now I need to change everything again. So full-length collection, I get to make those edits and go in a different direction.
So who are you reading now, and who fuels your imagination?
Ooh. Everyone and everything I can get my hands on in so many ways. I take my inspiration from everything. I mean, so like currently I'm reading, it's right on the ground, like Jericho's Brown, The Tradition is something I'm reading right now. I was reading some excerpts from A Wound from the Mouth of the Wound. I'm reading some James Baldwin right now. I'm reading through the latest edition of Plowshares. I'm reading CNN. I'm reading Fox News because I hate my life. I'm reading student papers. And student papers are often an interesting place for inspiration for me, because they'll say something that's rather interesting. And I'm like, well, I wasn't reading that text in the exact same way. So like my latest collection, Dust and Ashes, like that's all ekphrastic poems based off of literature and visual art. And some of those poems were influenced by conversations with students or readings from class. So like reading Flannery O'Connor or Toni Morrison or Ayad Akhtar, and they say something that's different than how I looked at it. And I'm all about my kids having different perspectives on text than I am. My motto is, if I'm not learning from them, I need to quit. So even reading their ways of seeing things, things fall apart. I've been grading papers for Things Fall Apart all weekend, and kids have made arguments about Okonkwo and Obierka that are just different than the way that I was thinking. So I find myself picking up the text again and going, okay, maybe my old behind was wrong about how I've been reading this for the past however many decades, and I need to like adjust to what my 6-year-old student has said. So yeah, I try to draw inspiration from everything that is around me, because if I'm not learning, then I'm not really breathing.
Share a couple more poems with us, if you would.
Sure. From my new collection, Dust and Ashes. And this poem is entitled A Home Burial. It's drawn from Robert Frost's poem, Home Burial. A home burial. He sits below the window. Dull sunlight, the lamp which slowly warms his kitchen table. He doesn't know how to ask the questions rising from the contradictions. Lost in silence, he awaits their ancient answers. As morning spills across the page, he sees. The wonder is he didn't see before, never once looked at it from here, being a man of simplest beliefs. These words, resting cool beneath his touch. Sepulchral as 3 slabs of slate, one of marble chipped. This little graveyard where his people are. He sees the dirt which leapt to cover them, Sunday spade applied with good intentions. But there are no resurrections. Hope lies beside them. Closing words in red and black, he laughs the worst laugh he has ever laughed. Cursed, he thinks. Cursed by a God he now finds unfamiliar. He begins to see how 3 foggy mornings or 1 rainy day can rot the best faith a man can build, shake foundations laid by fathers, mothers gone. A man who cannot speak of a faith lost, like his wife upstairs in bed, fetal and always facing the wall, lost like the child they only held in gray pictures. He looks towards the darkened parlor, curtains drawn against the light, his coat, his keys, the door. He sees the world as full of grief, evil he wants to change. He's inconsolable and wants to stand beyond the light, to go. He needs something more than words to follow, to bring him back to life, even by force. One other poem from the same collection. This one is inspired by the parable of the Good Samaritan in the Gospel according to Luke in the Christian New Testament. It's entitled, "And Who is My Neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from insert place of work, convenience store, home, or church, to insert place of work, convenience store, home, or church, unarmed, and fell into the hand of officers who stopped him for inserting while black reason. They shot him, stood above his leaking body, and left him for dead. Now, by chance, a white man, evangelical, was going down his Twitter feed. And when he saw him, he scrolled quickly past saying, #Blue Lives Matter. Likewise, a white woman, Presbyterian, came to the place on her Facebook feed. She saw him and scrolled quickly past saying, #All Lives Matter. But when, insert the least expected, saw him, they came near. Moved with pity and outrage, they went to the dead man's family to bandage their wounds, pouring action and appropriate silence as compassion. They put the burdens on their backs, addressed them as they were able. The next day they had not forgotten, but took 2 friends and encouraged them to more than march or #the moment, saying, we will continue the work together. Be not afraid. The Lord will repay whatever social capital we spend. Then Jesus asked, which of these 3 was a neighbor to the man who fell into unholy hands? The insert asshole playing devil's advocate said, the one who acknowledged his dignity. And Jesus replied, now go and do likewise.
Let's dig into your craft a bit and talk about the poetic elements you use. Which poetic elements do you tend to rely on, and which ones do you tend to ignore?
Tend to ignore rhyme, or I should say end-stopped rhyme. I am not, and it's actually sort of funny because as a musician, I write songs all the time. I cannot write music without rhyming, both end-stopped rhyme and internal rhyme. I mean, that's part of my like hip hop and gospel background, but it's like rhyme, 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 rhyme. In my poetry, there might be internal rhymes. There's like some assonance and consonants, sibilants often, but like end-stop rhyme, I just can't. Something that I do rely on that I'm actually trying to use less of is alliteration. I actually was mocked recently by one of my students for using too much alliteration in a poem. And I was like, wow, I have to grade your papers later on and you're making fun of me. Just want to point that out. So alliteration is definitely something I use a lot of. I try to use a lot of powerful or striking imagery. I look to leave not just diction in the mind of the reader, but also an image that leaves them going, oh, I can see that. Like this like I can experience this a lot more, show don't tell. Like I can see this image, I can viscerally experience it instead of just having a proposition in my head. And that's something that I work on hard because I know that I have a propensity to say more than I show. And so my revision process is often going back and saying, all right, I said this thing, how can I show that instead? My theological sonnets, that's where I struggle with it the most, because I have like this heady idea that I want to talk about and to use all of these big words. And now it's like, all right, well, how do I show that in a way that everyone can access and still get to the heady idea after the fact?
How do you approach endings, openings, line breaks?
So, and this kind of goes back to like my writing revision process. So the thought that's crossing my mind is, I think it was C.S. Lewis talked about writing the Chronicles of Narnia. Like he was asked how did he start the entire thing, and he said he had the image of a fawn standing under the light post, and he just kind of went from there and created everything else from there. A lot of my poems are like that. There will be an image or a line that stands out first, and I created everything around that. But that line is not always the beginning. Sometimes it's the ending. So like sometimes I'll just be the very last thing I know. This is the ending of this poem. I need to work, backwards design planning, the good teacher that I am, and figure out how to get to this ending. Sometimes it is the first line. Sometimes I know it's something in the middle. So it really depends on what that first image or first phrase is, and I'm working from there. Beyond that, it's always a hodgepodge. I have found that some poems I know what the ending is, and then I take a poem that I've been working on for like 6 years, and I just bring the images for that into it, and I'm like, oh, these suddenly work together. Like that poem that I thought was garbage, I can suddenly bring in, and that is the beginning that I've needed for this ending. One of the poems that's in Dust and Ashes is exactly that. Like it was a poem that I wrote, I started writing probably a decade ago, and then recent events just gave me this line that I was able to sort of mash them together, and then, oh, this is what it was waiting for right now to suddenly become the full poem that it was always meant to be in some ways.
That's good stuff. Brother Al.
Oftentimes, as an educator, which you are, and also as a poet or a writer, you have resources that help guide you. Do you have like resource books or exercises that you recommend or that you use to help guide your writing process?
So most of them I do. Like some of them I got was during my MFA program. Western Wind was a textbook that I was recommended to me, and I'm not sure if it's still being in print or not. But Western Wind was just so great. It had both, an anthology of poems, but at the same time, exercises all throughout. That doing those exercises actually helped me hone my craft. And it wasn't in like a hokey way. Like I really felt that I benefited from those. Anything by Mary Oliver, both The Rules for the Dance and there's another book of hers that I'm completely blanking on right now that I've used with my own students. But both of those collections were amazing for me. Trying to think. Oh, yes. That's the other one. What's the other book that I'm thinking of? Oh, Ordering the Storm, which I mentioned beforehand about putting, collections together. That was also useful because the ways in which it talked about ordering poems in a collection, some of those also helped me think about ordering stanzas in poems, or, moving things in different places within poems, even though they were talking about larger collections. So that was a wonderful resource. And I believe the book it's either called Forwards and Backwards or Backwards and Forwards. And that's a book on drama and teaching drama for English teachers, but that also helped influence how I changed how I wrote poetry as well. So that's another collection or another tome that I thought was just great.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of advice you could give to the emerging poet about working, past frustration to get better, past rejection or early, not having early success, but being persistent. What advice would you give to the emerging writer?
It sounds trite, but or cynical, expect rejection, because then it makes everything, feel that much better. Like if you're going to it assuming I'm going to be rejected and then your very first thing gets published. I mean, this which happened to a student of mine. Like, I was like, just expect rejection. And then like the first two things he sent out both got accepted and like he won an award. And I was like, all right, so your batting record is better than mine, student of mine. So, you're off to a good start. Beyond that, I would say just keep plugging. I mean, for me, it always came down to, what am I writing for? Like, am I writing to get accolades from other people, or am I writing because there's something that I feel I need to say and I want to get off my chest, or I want to express to the world, or I want to capture for other people, or like, the stories of my kids that I want to tell. Like, that's my primary focus, not to be published. And there are poems that I've put out there that there are certain poems that I put out in the world specifically because there were editors who I wanted to read that poem just to be like, hey, you editor, I want you to think about this. Like, I just want you to think about this. Just like as you're making choices of who you publish or who you don't publish, like, just think about this. And in some cases, I get a very terse response back that's like, we're not publishing this. In other cases, someone's like, ooh, that made me think, and I do want to publish this. So for like writers who are just starting off, remember what your focus is. What is your goal? Like, if it's about publication, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but like, try to, dig deeper. What is your love? What is your passion for writing? And hold on to that, so that when that first or second or 25th publication does come in, you're still as hungry to keep writing. It's not just about getting published.
How can our listeners get hold of your collections?
The easiest way would be to check out my website, www.mehpoeting.com. You're able to buy both collections right there, directly from me.
How about reading two last poems for us?
Sure. Both of these poems are in what I hope to be my first full-length collection. So, anyone who's a publisher out there who has the manuscript, if you want to publish it, hey, that'd be great. This first one was recently just published in the latest edition of Plowshares, and it is called 12 Minutes a Slave. We held a slave auction in class today. Probably not a state-sanctioned component of AP US history, but Mr. S made a block out of the front row desks, cornered it off with backwards-facing chairs. He shame-forced Tony Miller above us and introduced him as item number 5. He'd prepared a catalog, a one-sided sepia sheet with Tony's description and a starting price. Before the bidding began, Mr. S made Tony turn in perfect circles so we could all see what we were getting. Made him show his gums and teeth, roll up his sleeves and flex, lift an Oxford unabridged over his head and strain for as long as he could. We were encouraged to holler, not yell, intrusive questions about Tony's pedigree and prior owners, to discuss if he was better suited for house or field, to speculate about breeding options. After Tony climbed down, unable to meet our eyes or the oppressive silence, I was almost ashamed that a white teacher treating one of his own like this made my brown skin rattle with the joy of falling chains. I need to mention, that's a true story. And the last poem was published recently by Frontier Poetry. It's entitled, An Open Letter to Our White Friends and Supposed Allies. You should know, we play a game, all of us. We imagine the aftermath of our official lynching, the result of the inevitable traffic stop, the armed wrong invasion of our residence, or merely walking, sitting, sleeping, existing anywhere a warrant has been issued for our skin crime. And so we all hope we will rate a riot. We count the tweets and t-shirts, the virility of our hashtag memorials, the number of racist statues and statutes with nooses around their stone necks, the number of buildings and cop cars burned in our name, in all of our names, and knowing they will attempt to defame the days before our death, investigate how white our skeletons. The more competitive among us go the extra mile to replace your cardboard with Molotov cocktails. We have scrubbed the earth of all pictures with do-rags or without diplomas. We consistently choose church over the club, kale over cools. We preset our radios to the local NPR affiliate and give to charities like Others Daily Dawn clean underwear. We keep our talk screens and browser histories as open and inside as our hands to leave no excuse. And still, we wonder what you will say, what you will do when the time comes, compared to what you are doing right now.
That's awesome.
Yes. You got to call people out. It's important to call people out. Kindness to a bully or a tyrant encourages them. It does not give them pause. Rather, it makes them feel empowered. We must continually call out injustice and sometimes do more than call out. We want to thank you for this wonderful interview. This has been the poet Matthew E. Henry. He's an educator, a poet, a writer, a philosopher, and we thank you.
I thank you. Thank you very much for having me. This was wonderful.